everyone, my name is Adam Leventhal. Welcome to a new instalment of the Premier Sports Network's Player Care series. Today we are discussing the considerations for athletes post-Brexit. And as you can see, a wonderful panel is waiting to speak to you. We are joined by Michael Johnson, who is an England under-21 football coach, Karen Moorhouse, who is the Chief Regulatory Officer for the RFL, Rich Hudson, who is the Head of Cricket Operations at the PCA, and Leanne Cottrell, who is Head of Immigration at Sterling Lexicon. They're a global relocation firm, trusted partner of the Premier Sports Network, who help athletes with their relocation requirements, taking care of everything from transporting personal belongings to guiding athletes on key neighbourhood choices or offering family support and answering your immigration questions as well. So we're going to get through a whole range of areas concerning athletes with a range of sports and all the considerations post-Brexit with our panel now. Let's start with Michael, if I can. It's obviously a very interesting scenario in football at the moment because we don't quite know what the impact is going to be longer term. And from your point of view as an England coach, obviously your priority is to have a successful England team. It might have different implications, you know, in domestic club football. But from your point of view, what impact do you think Brexit will have on homegrown talent and having the opportunity to go and further their careers in Europe? Is it going to actually be of benefit to the England football team longer term, do you think?
Yeah, I would think so. I would think the opportunity now for a lot more academies now to be more aggressive in terms of recruitment of younger players, players playing in the first team at a younger age groups. Historically, we've seen some of our better talent leave the country, and obviously that now is potentially no longer going to be allowed. So the opportunities now for academies and first teams, managers, clubs to really promote youth, really develop youth. And obviously there'll be more likely that there's more youth going to be playing in a lot more of the first teams. Whether that would be enough in the Premier League is remains to be seen, because we all know, obviously, with the scoring system, some of those youngsters could be afforded by the better Premier League clubs. So that's their way probably around it. But, you know, when you look, you know, Championship, definitely in the Championship, you would probably see a lot more youth talent being given an opportunity as opposed to buying that in.
Yeah, we'll dig into the points-based system in football in a moment's time, but it is rather complicated. It's always quite interesting when you're sort of discussing transfer stories and things like that you can actually do your own due diligence and go, well, he's not going to qualify, so I don't know why they're talking about him anyway. But Karen, from your point of view in rugby, I mean, just to outline what the sort of new rules and regulations are in place for foreign players, for people that aren't aware.
Sure. Rugby league, I suspect, will be less impacted than football because in the main we have less players who historically have relied on a European passport as their route to play in Great Britain, in the UK. In the past, that was sufficient. If you had an EU passport, you could come and play for any of our UK clubs. Now, anyone from the EU who wants to come and play for one of the clubs based in the UK will have to apply for and get a governing body endorsement in the same way that any players coming from Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Islands would have to do. And to do that, they have to meet a certain performance standard. And the test is about being an internationally established elite athlete. So you've got to have proven your worth. You've got to prove that you're at a certain quality. And so what it will close off is the ability to find that young talent, to spot the up and coming superstars, because they won't meet that criteria. It means that you're perhaps looking at people who've played for a number of years already in a competition, have proved their value before you can actually then bring them into the UK. So we worked with UK border agencies over the course of the last 12 months to update our governing body endorsement requirements so that they covered off the EU in addition to the rest of the world. There was only small tweaks, in effect, making sure we'd covered all international members rather than just those outside the EU. And equally, we've got a slight quirk because we have a couple of French teams who play in our competitions. So Catalans Dragons and Toulouse Olympique, based obviously in the south of France, but play in UK competitions. So we had to just make sure that those players weren't excluded, i.e. that they could base their application to come to the UK on matches that they played for those clubs. So as you said, relatively early days. As a sport, I suspect we're going to be less impacted than football and rugby union and some other sports, and we're just going to have to work through it. I suspect that people who work in the industry, it's a great time for them, because really the main things we flagged to our clubs are allow more time, it's going to be complicated, you'll have to fill out more paperwork, and there'll be a bill at the end of it.
Yeah, which is music to everyone, every administrator's ears, I'm sure. Rich, in cricket, how does it work now? Obviously, we know that there's Colpack. For people who aren't familiar with Colpack, maybe you can explain that. But what changes have you already seen? Because obviously we're off season domestically, so you've had maybe a little bit more of an advantage to sort of get to the base of all these new rulings.
Yeah, I think to answer your original question in the sense of what is Colpack, it's probably a fairly broad term actually that's thrown around in cricket, which actually I think is often misunderstood. Colpack has been the term that's been used for any player who isn't an overseas player but isn't actually eligible to play for England. So that included the EU passport holders who weren't Colpacks. They were here by virtue of their EU nationality, and also the player, the South African who played at Northants with a British passport. He wasn't relying on the Colpack rulings to be here. So we I think when we went through this process over the last sort of 12, 18 months, it's been quite key to differentiate who those groups are. So to split those out. So I think in terms of moving forward, what impacts it having, we only had a relatively small number, so probably early 20s, actual Colpack players who were affected by this. And what ECB decided to do through it, which I think had broad support from the game, actually, the counties were very much on board with this. PCA were behind it, was to increase our overseas player quotas. So what that meant was that although some of our Colpack players were losing their rights to be considered non-overseas over here, that was mitigated by the fact that we increased the overseas player quotas in 50 over cricket and championship cricket. So the majority of those, not all, but the majority did actually secure overseas contracts for this 2021 season. And the ECB have also decided to, as part of that consultation, widen out our visa criteria a little bit. So to get a governing body endorsement, it's been relaxed slightly, which is linked back to the 100, which in terms of the broader sort of player development consideration and how that's going to impact the standard over here, is going to allow counties to be a bit more creative in terms of the types of players that they can go out and recruit. So I think it's been a pretty well considered process actually from sort of the stakeholders within cricket.
Leanne, if I can come to you now, I mean, in terms of these new rules, what are the key sort of implications that you have noticed? Because obviously you're dealing with a range of sports and organisations.
Sure. Well, I think ultimately Karen summed it up fairly well in that the biggest impact is really the increase in administration and cost that goes into the system. So as everyone said, essentially, EU nationals are now classified as third country nationals, or the same as third country nationals from a UK Home Office perspective. And what that means is that they need to be eligible for some kind of clearance under the domestic system. So for most professional sports persons, it is the sports person's route, which is relying on that governing body endorsement. Now, realistically, for top tier clubs, for those top players, navigating the endorsement system isn't at all. It is just the costs that go into a typical immigration application and the administration behind it. Albeit in the grand scheme of things, when you look at the remainder of the system, it's actually not too bad. So as a general rule, you'll be able to get people in within a couple of weeks or so. So it's not a hugely lengthy process. I think realistically what the biggest implications are going to be are on those lower tier clubs or for more the support staff within the industry, because they don't have niche categories to qualify under. So I think you are going to find situations where if you look at sports where you've got for example, huge numbers of grooms or stable hands or things like that, they're really, really going to struggle to get those individuals into the one thing to be mindful of is even if there is a category that is actually someone is eligible for, which is not the true sports person route, a lot of these categories actually have restrictions as to what activities you can actually do on them. So for a lot of the UK categories, acting as a sports person professionally is actually not permitted. So even if you can navigate the system and find a category that someone's actually eligible for, there may well be restrictions on that, which then prohibit the activities which they wish to conduct. Realistically as well, you're going to look at an increase in compliance obligations on the clubs. So anyone that is under the official sports person category, the clubs are, fundamentally responsible for them. So they will have these obligations to the Home Office to make sure that they are notifying them if they go on loan, things like that, if they're monitoring their attendance, their absences, and so on. So you are putting an increase on the onus on the clubs to actually manage these players' statuses and ensure that they ultimately comply with the requirements that are in force.
Michael, from the sort of the footballing side of things, is there the feeling that we're not going to see, because of the, as Karen was talking about, and obviously it's applicable in football as well with the points-based system, that you're almost ensuring that the caliber of players that are coming over are, well, I suppose guaranteed. So you're not going to have pathways blocked as much by players that maybe, shouldn't be holding back homegrown talent. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we're going to see a lot more, and I see your point. How you try and word a lot more players what are going to benefit the game, benefit the industry. I think the pathways now will be clearer for young talent to be developed. There'll be a lot more care, a lot more thought process around youth talent now, because the opportunity now is to develop your own. I'm really going to be interested to see how a lot of the top clubs still will still operate, to see if they take advantage of the opportunity to develop their own, or will they, with the finances that we know and the real interest in finding top talent early, whether they're still going to go down that route. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that patterns out. But for sure, that a lot more clubs now will take this opportunity, particularly in the Championship, in terms of developing their players.
Karen, from your point of view, has it been difficult with the players? And I'm not sure what the typical length in rugby league of contracts is, but has it been difficult? I know it has been in football, whereby this has changed and contracts have almost had to be not necessarily altered, but the future planning in terms of contractual rights of players has had to change sort of on the fly a little bit, hasn't it?
I think the players who were already in the country had the ability to apply for settled status.
Yeah.
So we certainly worked with our clubs over the last year to make sure that anyone who was playing in this country already on the basis of an EU passport went through the process themselves, and for all of their dependents, to make sure they got the benefit of that settled status. So I think we've done a good job in making sure that no one's existing rights are impacted. I think then it'll be probably more moving forward around the position of players who are coming in on governing body endorsements and how that is managed by clubs. And I'll come back to the financial bit, which is, even though I think Leanne covered it well in terms of if you get the systems right, you can get this through relatively quickly. The costs do add up, particularly if you're bringing over a wife or a partner, and if you're bringing over a number of children as well, that actually when you work through the process, there's a number of additional costs that, particularly perhaps for some of our clubs who aren't at the top level, will possibly swing the balance in terms of whether you might want to sign a player from the EU as opposed to signing a player from the UK. I think Michael's points are really interesting. And again, I know Rich referred to the Colpack rule. It's a slightly weird one for governing bodies, because actually over the years, we've really encouraged our clubs to develop British English talent because we want that for our teams. And in a way, Brexit absolutely backs up what we've been wanting clubs to do for years. So we want to help the clubs navigate it. We want to make sure that we get the right players in the system. But looking at it purely with a selfish national team hat on, this is actually quite supportive of what we're trying to achieve, making sure that our clubs do invest and develop English players rather than possibly taking what in the past was seen as an easier route of buying talent from overseas that was available at a cheaper cost.
Rich, in cricket, obviously it seems to be structured with quite a natural pathway towards the national team, that there is agreement. Obviously there's central contracts and everyone is working towards almost, improving the England side. Obviously there are external competitions and it's a commercial, business, obviously, and you want the domestic competitions to be strong as well. But do you feel, from what you're hearing from the counties and the players, that this is ultimately going to lead to a better England side?
Yeah, I think it was interesting actually hearing Karen just talk from the governing body side actually, and I think that there is a feeling amongst our members that the presence of Colpack cricketers has been a positive in the game. I don't think anyone can argue that the quality that the likes of your Carl Abbots and Simon Harmers have brought in domestically into our game, I think has improved the quality domestically, and I think at a level where balance is struck correctly between players who are eligible to play for England and players who aren't, that it seemed, I think counties have self-regulated themselves pretty well with that, and with the sort of financial incentives for producing England eligible cricketers. I think all of those measures have self-regulated themselves reasonably well from a cricket perspective. Moving forward, I think it's something that the sport as a whole just needs to continue to monitor, and they need to continue to monitor that the balance is struck between overseas players and domestically eligible players who are going to go on and play for their country. So I think there's a feeling from stakeholders that balance is reasonably well struck at the moment, but it needs to be continued to monitor. I do think we're going to see more and more opportunities for English players while still being supplemented by hopefully high quality overseas talent alongside it.
Leanne, what are the main issues that are being brought up by the clubs and organisations that you're working with in terms of the transition of bringing players in, but also players going out as well? What are the sort of the main issues that keep cropping up at the moment? Because it's still very fresh, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And something's worth being mindful of is the reality is something will probably change over the coming months. Essentially the treatment that's afforded to EU nationals in the UK and conversely Brits in the EU member states is all subject to the agreements that the UK is party to. So if the UK subsequently become party to another agreement, that may well change the dynamics anyway. So I think fundamentally the lack of information, the late release of information is absolutely tripping people up. I think from a long-term playing perspective, there hasn't been too many issues though, in that people are quite aware that fundamentally, if the player is going into an EU member state, that they need the appropriate right to play there. And for most member states, they very much operate like the UK, in essentially there is a governing body and they're the ones that say yes or no to whether a sports person is eligible. And if they say yes, then quite frankly, the government says yes too. So there is a general awareness for long-term players or those that are at the top of their sport. The issues that people seem to have not really considered or that are starting to actually have an impact now are things such as, okay, well, what if someone is going for a one-off game? What if someone's going for training? What if someone's going for more promotional type activities? Because that is something that typically would have been that someone pops over, they go to France for a couple of weeks at a time and don't particularly think twice about it. Whereas now there are more requirements to navigate. And I think only over time will we get clarity in terms of the specifics as to whether something is or isn't allowed. But it's more the short-term trips that I would say are causing issues right now, albeit once people realise what they need to navigate, then they are actually fairly easy to do that. It's just that awareness of, oh, wait a minute, actually now there is a process, whereas before there wasn't one.
Okay, yeah, that is interesting. Michael, from your point of view, obviously, having played the game at different levels, the actual, a lot of the sort of the narrative, I suppose, that we've been talking about is the benefits and, promoting young talent and things like that. And there will still be foreign players coming over to the UK to play football. But from your point of view, the actual benefits of having foreign players, if that is going to be reduced, is there a danger that we won't be nourishing our leagues as much because that talent will simply either be ruled out because they haven't got enough points, or they might just be dissuaded from coming to England because of Brexit, for, I don't know, for political reasons or whatever? Is there a danger that we are maybe going to lose a little bit of that quality that was helping our football pyramid as a whole?
I think there's no getting away from the fact that we've had some wonderful young talent on our shores that have blessed Premier League, blessed us all when we've watched football, and they have added to the experience of the football landscape and industry. And I still think that will be so, because you will still get the top players who will still be in and around the footballing fraternity. Obviously, what we're talking about is that real young age, 18 and below. So those that are above 18 who might benefit from the scoring system, they will be the ones that will be now obviously spreading their culture and insights from their homeland from the European nation. So I still think that the product of the game, with the amount of players that we have at the top level who are from different countries, different nationalities, different cultures, are still benefiting the environment of football.
Okay, that's interesting. Karen, from your point of view, are there other sort of legal aspects that clubs and athletes need to consider at this time in particular? And obviously, just to throw in a pandemic at the same time, just to really sort of make everything just really, really easy.
You must have totally read my mind, because that's exactly what I was going to say. At the moment, it's quite hard actually to distinguish which challenges are Brexit and which challenges are actually, because as you say, we're living through a global pandemic. So perfect example, our two teams in France, Catalans and Toulouse, where our seasons are due to start in March. One of the things we're grappling with at the moment is how we get teams into and out of France without the requirement to quarantine. At the moment, there is a cross-border elite dispensation coming into the UK, but there are still discussions ongoing about whether there is a reciprocal one within France. That's not Brexit, that's a global pandemic. And that's what we're grappling with at the moment. Again, when we look ahead and try and envisage what the season's going to be like, we'd already planned, thinking about Brexit, that clubs were going to have to allow more time because they'd have to go in the non-EU passport queue rather than the EU passport queue. But then you add on top of that everything to do with COVID, and the whole logistics about travelling between any two countries is going to be so much more complex, demonstrating at the moment that you've got the relevant tests. Again, we all heard the announcements last night from government around the increased number of tests that people will need to have to come into the UK, and then working out the equivalent for players going into France, and therefore making sure they've had the right tests at the right amount of time before the travel, both into and out of the country, just means that the whole international element of sport is phenomenally complex at the moment.
Is that what you're feeling as well in cricket, from the cricketers and from the counties as well, that extra logistical element of the pandemic is almost muddying the waters about the new rulings post Brexit? It's quite difficult to sort of distinguish what issue is what.
Yeah, I think from a cricket perspective, the pandemic is absolutely creating exactly the same kind of complications that Karen just outlined. I think we're dealing with maybe a slightly simpler dynamic because we're only dealing with incoming at this stage, and that's we're not having to sort of deal with teams based cross borders. So we know, so clearly all of our counties contained here eliminates one element of the challenges clearly that Karen's facing. But I think our first class counties have got a decent grasp on the impact of Brexit and what it's meant. Most of those challenges I think have been addressed. So I think most of them have been clear coming into the new year, or at least very early in the new year, what they were requiring to do to maintain player registrations or players that they were looking to bring in. But I think we might find that one or two get caught out by the combination of some additional paperwork that Leanne's obviously spoken about that's going to that's obviously going to make this a slightly harder prospect. But I think it's the pandemic that's going to create as many challenges, and frankly more so getting players in from some of these red list countries. Cricket just being affected, particularly with lads coming in from South Africa. That's one where we know that there's going to be some questions and some challenges coming our way in the next 6 weeks or so.
Yeah.
So if I can just jump in, it's quite ironic, but in some respects we see COVID as having had some benefits to the UK immigration system in that whenever a new system is implemented, inevitably there's teething issues or there's problems that arise as a result. But because we've got the pandemic, quite frankly, the users of the system are so low at the moment that it's actually proving to be quite a good pilot phase for the actual system. So we are seeing those limited numbers actually being of benefit right now, because it is allowing the Home Office time to actually ascertain where the issues are and then rectifying those. Whereas if we weren't mid-pandemic, I think it's very fair to say that we would have experienced some fairly major teething issues to this new system. So I know it's causing multiple issues and confusions and things such as that, but actually in some respects, it's been fairly good as well.
And what are those chief issues that you're learning about that they're actually going, but we need to find workarounds for this? Otherwise, when it is at full capacity, it's going to be an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, it's more things such as the Home Office have made various commitments to process certain things within certain periods of time. Those timeframes for some things are actually very, very tight. So it's allowed them the opportunity to see whether actually that's achievable or not. We also need to be realistic. So not necessarily from an athlete or a sports person perspective, but we've gone from a situation where only those organisations that needed to support third country nationals had to be licensed with the Home Office. So there was about 30,000, I believe, registered, to the fact that pretty much most organisations in the UK now need to be licensed with the Home Office because they'll have to support EU nationals as well. So you've got a massive influx of users to the system. And it was just seeing whether actually the internal resource and the internal systems can manage that sheer number of users, and quite frankly, users that aren't necessarily of the same, don't necessarily want to say caliber, but of the same operating standards as what the Home Office are used to. So those have been the main issues. But as I say, touch wood, at the moment, it's actually going very well, or certainly appears to be anyway.
Okay, that's interesting. Michael, I just wanted to sort of get a general point from you, maybe as we sort of sum up with each of our guests, just what you're hearing from within the game on the top. We'll leave the pandemic, because that was obviously causing all sorts of different issues, and obviously will cause issues for tournaments and things like that. But from within the game, academy level, from parents of younger children that you might meet, in the academy system, and youngsters who are sort of teens now, and now thinking, you know what, this is actually going to be of benefit to my son or my daughter, or whatever it is. What is the conversation about post-Brexit football for you?
A lot of youngsters are now thriving on this opportunity to potentially climb the ladder and be given a real go at it. The academies have been doing some marvelous work over the last 10, 15 years. We can see that in the influx of young players which are now playing Premier League football, which are now entering Gareth Southgate's first team seniors. But I think there's that next layer where, the more often than not, youngsters maybe have struggled in that Championship, League One. We've all seen the numbers of players that have been released. Well, I think now's a real opportunity for talent to be really nurtured, and not just for their own well-being, but also potentially to move on to some Premier League clubs. Now, we may now be looking at, you know, some of the other academies in England and saying, well, okay, we can't go abroad, but maybe there might be some development in League One clubs, in Championship clubs in the academy with young players, which now is spurring a lot more academies on coaches to do some excellent work. They've been doing it anyway, but I think now there's a real opportunity for them to really drive home, whether that's for their own club or actually for talent to be moved on.
Yeah, I suppose ultimately it's almost like a catalyst to sort of reinvigorate everyone to that goal. Karen, from your point of view, just a sort of a general conclusion, really, and this isn't, you know, I'm sure we all have our different political views. I'm sure some will be pro-Brexit, some will be vehemently anti-Brexit. But in terms of, you know, the organisation, you know, the RFL, is this almost seen as an opportunity for making things better, or is it another headache that you could do without?
Yeah, I'm probably going to violently sit on the fence and say that we probably perceive it relatively neutrally. I think we had a decent framework in place before, a bit like Rich was saying. In cricket, we have non-federation trained rules, so limiting the number of players in each Super League first team who weren't trained within our federation. So I felt we probably dealt with some of the challenges before Brexit around trying to make sure there was opportunity for young British talent. I guess I want to probably reserve judgment until we actually have teams travelling into and back from France, because I think that will be the real test of whether the impact of Brexit makes cross-border sport more complicated. And I'll give you a view in April.
Yeah, okay, we'll make a date to check in with each other on that. I mean, I suppose the same question. The same question to you, Rich, from, you know, the PCA members. Is this because obviously cricket is a very it's an international sport beyond Europe. There's not a huge amount of, you know, cricket being played in Europe. The Dutch had a good side. I remember they did pretty well against England. I remember them rolling them over. I think it was at Lords, was it not? Anyway, that's by the by. But you know, just in general terms, is this seen as an opportunity, a positive, or is it just another headache?
I think I'm going to be similar to Karen probably and get slight splinters. I think we obviously sort of look at it through a player association lens, and I think you're looking at it from a slightly different perspective. So we're kind of looking at it through a collective and an individual perspective. There are individuals within our membership who have been affected negatively by this, and on behalf, when you consider their individual situations, you can only have sympathy where they've been negatively impacted by what's happened. From a broad collective perspective, and from the game moving forward, I guess it's seen as an opportunity now for ECB in developing the best possible national side we can have, and ultimately that's one of the key influences and key targets, as well as development more broadly. But I think it's seen as an opportunity now for ECB to have a little bit more control over how they balance the influence of needing overseas talent, which has absolutely had positive impact on the English county system, versus the development of young English talent that goes on to play for our national side. So that overseas versus English debate is now something that I think ECB can influence a little bit more strongly. And I think that's probably seen as a positive.
And Leanne, finally from you, with your expertise, is there anything that you think is important in this discussion that we haven't stuck a flag in yet?
No, I think we've covered off most things. I think the only thing that I would just stress the point, Karen touched upon it earlier, that you'd encouraged your clubs to make sure anyone that was eligible under the settlement scheme had applied for status. It's just to really reiterate that point. So essentially, any EU nationals that were in the UK before the end of last year, and quite frankly, they don't need to be here right now. It could have been just that they were here last year and are currently overseas, making sure that they've applied to secure their status, The route is open until the end of June, so there's plenty of time to do that. Those that aren't eligible, just really drumming into the players and the clubs that preparation is really the only way to navigate this, that there is going to be added complexities. Unfortunately, there's not a huge amount we can do to change that, but just making sure that the players are ready to embrace it, that they're aware of any ongoing conditions that they may well have enforced against them. One of the biggest things is probably going to be that those that are eligible under the sports person route or various other employment type routes, there are residency requirements. So just making sure that they abide by those requirements, because otherwise we're going to get to a stage in sort of 5-6 years time where all of a sudden there's going to be a massive deficit, because those people that started into the schemes now are no longer able to extend, or they're not eligible for residency. So it's just making sure that that awareness exists, because as I say, otherwise in the future we will encounter quite major issues.
Leanne, excellent work. Full briefing. I think everyone that's watching at home, I think we've pretty much covered everything. Hopefully we've left no stone unturned. I really appreciate your time, Leanne, to Karen, to Rich, and to Michael for joining us on this Premier Sports Network Player Care webinar. For everyone who has watched, thank you very much for joining us and spending your time with us. If you want to contact Premier Sports Network and find out any more information about the topics that we've obviously been discussing, get in touch with them. The links are available around this webinar, I am sure. And also look out for future webinars on, maybe we'll check in, as Karen has alluded to, we'll check in on Brexit maybe in sort of 6 months' time and see how it's all going. And hopefully we're not talking so much about the pandemic as well, but also on a whole other range of topics that the Premier Sports Network cover in player care, in finance, and many more besides as well. So thank you very much for your time. Take care. Look after yourselves. Thank you.